Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, this episode is brought to you by Brilliant. Brilliant is a website and an app that teaches you how to think and solve problems with fun, interactive lessons in STEM. Science, technology, engineering, and math. Of course, you knew that. With Brilliant's hands-on approach, you'll learn by doing instead of listening to lectures. It's a better and more fun way to learn. All of Brilliant's courses have storytelling, code writing, interactive challenges, and problems to solve. Brilliant offers many well-curated sequences of problems that help you to master all sorts of technical subjects. If you're interested in physics, you can try out their courses on classical mechanics and gravitational physics. If you like computers and coding, you can check out their courses on computer science fundamentals and programming with Python. Anyway, Brilliant has a vast array of courses, lots and lots in other fields as well, that can help you achieve your goals in STEM, starting with one small commitment to learning and building up to long-term challenge and growth. To check out the many courses available and find out the one that's right for you, you can go to brilliant.org, and to get a free sign up for free or free trial, you go to brilliant.org/Michael Shermer. That's MICHAELSHERMER. Just make sure you get it right. Brilliant.org/Michael Shermer. You sign up for free and give it a shot. As you know, I'm very interested in all forms of online content. I consume a lot of it myself, and Brilliant is a great new website. Check it out. All right. Thanks for listening. And here's the podcast. My guest today is the great Tom Nichols. His new book is Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. Tom is professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. He's a columnist for USA Today and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. He's the author of The Death of Expertise, which I have right here, another one of my favorite books of his. The Campaign Against Established Knowledge and Why It Matters. Actually, this book have been brought out this year with all the COVID craziness and climate change, skepticism, and so on. Anyway, he also wrote No Use, Nuclear Weapons and U.S. National Security, and Eve of Destruction, The Coming Age of Preventative War. He's also an instructor at the Harvard Extension School and an adjunct professor at the U.S. Air Force School of Strategic Force Studies. He's a former aide in the U.S. Senate and has been a fellow of the International Security Program at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Tom and I discuss the current threats to liberal democracies around the world, including and especially the United States. He's not an existentialist threat monger. He doesn't think the world's about to collapse, but he does think these threats are real and we should pay attention to them. We talk about Afghanistan, why we went there in the first place, how it ended and why it ended the way it does. Is terrorism really an existential threat? We agree that it's probably not. And we also agree with some of John Mueller's book, The Stupidity of War, that a lot of wars are, in hindsight, wasteful. But we always have to remember the curse of knowledge and the hindsight bias that we know a lot that they didn't know then. We talk about the insurrection on January 6th, QAnon and other conspiracy theories, and on both the right and the left. And we spend the first part of the conversation hammering pretty hard on the right, and then we end the conversation toward the end of hammering on the far left, and why both extremes are not healthy for a good liberal democracy like ours. We talk about the psychology of what appeals to people about authoritarians on both the left and the right, and BLM movement, the anti-racism, the Me Too, the woke movement. And then we kind of look at the future of liberal democracy and how, in fact, it's up to us to keep our democracy robust. So I think it was a really interesting conversation. He's really a deep thinker on a lot of these issues, and I learned a lot from it. I hope you do too. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. All right, Tom. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming on the show. The new book is Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. I read your previous book, The Death of Expertise, longtime fan, first time conversation, and I follow you on Twitter. You have one of the more amusing Twitter feeds, especially because of the comments you solicit and photographs of people on airplanes without their shoes on.
Yeah, I don't know how I became the patron saint of airborne footwear, but I did, just because I think it's kind of silly and immature to keep yanking your shoes off every time you sit down anywhere in public. And it just kind of took off. So
yes, it's kind of like you're trying to shift the norms of society. Like, this is disgusting. Don't do this. And when you see the pictures, you go, oh, yeah,
right,
it is disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, there's just, and I mean, it's childlike. I mean, it's a word I find myself using about our democracy and about our society more often, but it's really childlike. I mean, my daughter used to pull her shoes off every 3 seconds when she was 2.
Right. Right.
But
well, I see you've been doing a lot of media on Afghanistan. Of course, I want to get to that. But first, let's do a little biographical sketch and give our listeners and viewers a brief history of who you are and how you got to where you are, and including your political positions. You talk about this a little bit in your book, particularly about your father. I found this very amusing. Your father started off as an FDR Democrat and ended up as a Reaganite Republican. I wonder if we could, after your brief bios, go to that and maybe explain how 74 million people voted for the Republican Trump. Maybe there's a lesson from your father's own transition there. I'm not sure how to go about that.
Yeah, I'm not I'm not sure either. My background is that I grew up in Western Massachusetts, in a factory town. People hear Massachusetts and they think Boston and suburbs and colleges, but my hometown was factories and railroad tracks and that kind of stuff. And my parents were not educated people. They were both children of immigrants. My mother had a 9th grade education. My dad had a 10th grade education. I grew up in a kind of, as I say in the book, jail or college were both, likely outcomes at some point. My dad and my mom were kind of typical of a lot of white Northeastern working class ethnics who were all Democrats. JFK, my mother had a picture of JFK in the house right until she died in the 90s, and we left it there. My father, who had a picture of Reagan, I think when Reagan said he had Alzheimer's and was dying, I think my father, being an older guy, kind of felt like that one. My dad was not a big fan of politicians, but he kind of tacked up a picture of Reagan near his desk, I think out of sympathy. But my parents are the classic story of they didn't leave the Democratic Party. They felt that the Democratic Party after the late 60s had left them. My mother actually worked for a time as staff in anti-poverty programs like Great Society stuff in the late 60s and early 70s. But by the mid 70s, both of them were disillusioned, felt that living in liberal Massachusetts, that the things that had been tried for 20 years had failed. And like a lot of white Northeastern ethnics, they voted for Reagan, as Massachusetts did in 1984, as part of the 49 state sweep. So my mother was always, my mother was always more liberal. My father was old school, probably. I tried to kind of dig through his voting behavior once, and he voted for Eisenhower, of course, World War II veteran. I think I know my mother voted for Kennedy. My dad probably voted for Nixon. I asked him about that once. He said, yeah, but, we sort of knew Jack in this state, and we didn't, guys like me didn't want him. But by 68, they're both Nixon voters. By 72, they're Nixon voters. And again, pretty typical story for a lot of working class families in that period. My mother, I think, stayed liberal. My father was very right wing all through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. But then I tell the story about how in the last election of his life, where he didn't get to vote, he kind of shrugged and he said he looked at Obama running against Romney because Obama was running for re-election. And I said, Dad, I don't think Romney's going to be able to do this. And my father shrugged and he said, they're both good men. He said, we'll be fine no matter who wins.
Yeah, I love that story. It doesn't feel like the last two elections you would say that. I mean, they were kind of portrayed as, as it typically goes, this is the biggest election of my lifetime or the most important existential crisis, that sort of thing. It does feel different than that. Yeah, your description of
you certainly wouldn't have.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you certainly wouldn't have expected a 90-ish, white working class guy who watches a lot of Fox and CNBC to be sitting there and shrugging and saying, they're both good men. But my father, despite the fact that my father was poor, grew up, I say my father was not a progressive, but as I often tell people, that's a nice way of saying he was a bigot. He had all of the he was Archie Bunker.
Right.
My dad was Archie Bunker, except probably swore more. But at the end, he was always when Trump ran in 1999, my father just laughed at it. He said, this is not a job for idiots. This is a job for serious people. And that is something I took away from talking about politics with my father. I never stayed as conservative as my father was, but I always took away from it that politics is a serious business and you respect the president and the presidency, and that you treat this as something more than a joke.
Yeah. Now, like yesterday, there's pictures of Biden looking at his watch at the memorial service, and the day before he fell asleep during the meeting with the Israeli ambassador. And, all you see is just this attacks and making fun of the president and belittling the president as much as possible on both sides. I mean, Trump was, to be fair, an easy target for liberals to go after.
Yeah, Trump. Trump, making fun of Trump is just talking about what Trump did. Biden looking at his watch. I remember when George Bush took the same heat for looking at his watch during a debate. That's right. And it became like the story.
That's right. It was with Dukakis, I think that was. Yeah. So this town you grew up in, it reminded me
it was 90.
Early one.
It was it was the 19. I think it was 92.
Oh yeah. With
Clinton and Perot and Bush. They were sitting and kind of looked at his watch, and everybody said, "That's it. It's over. He's done." And unfortunately, they were right.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So the town you grew up in, this kind of reminded me of a Springsteen song or the Billy Joel song. I think you mentioned Allentown. I've been through Allentown, and I was listening to that song. This was in 1982. I went through there and raced across America. Our route from LA to New York on our bikes took us through Allentown, and I was listening on my Sony Walkman to that Billy Joel song. And there is this kind of sense of, there's always this sense like we've lost this golden past. It's gone. And even in the late 80s, when I went to some Springsteen concerts here in LA, he had like a fundraising thing at the intermission. Go out and put money in the buckets for the steel mills in whatever town it was, I think in New Jersey, that he was raising money for. And, there's that kind of sense of nostalgia you talk about that we always seem to have.
Yeah, I talk about Springsteen and Billy Joel and all of that, what I call decline rock, in the book. And, let me just, before I get hate mail, I love Bruce Springsteen. I listen to Springsteen, love Billy Joel. These are all a lot of my favorite songs too. But, as I've often said about Springsteen, every 10 years, that guy's town dies. Like if you listen to Bruce Springsteen's music since the 70s, wherever he is just like collapses on the dot every 10 or 12 years. And you start to say, geez, where do you live? And I think that this is mining a sense of nostalgia of a time when things were good. I mean, Bruce Springsteen was living in, writing about the desolation and the darkness on the edge of town and how awful it was to work in factories in the mid 70s. Well, by the mid 70s, he's right that all of the things that we think happened in the past few years had already happened 45 years ago. And we keep coming back to it. And it's like a scab that we keep picking off because it's an explanation for why you might be unemployed at the moment or why your hometown isn't as vibrant as you wish it were. But, as I point out in the book, when the writer Andre Dubus, who's also from Massachusetts, like me and Ian Bremmer and others I talked about in the book, he moves to Haverhill, Massachusetts in 1972, and his description of that town is indistinguishable from the way people talk about their towns now. And I'm trying to warn people that when they say, but it was better in 1978 or 1972 or 1965, what they're really talking about is they're remembering the kind of the stories of their grandparents about that magical 15 years right after World War II. And where, there was a time of, now, of course, it wasn't a time of plenty, and it wasn't a great time if you were Black or a woman or gay or any other marginalized or minority community. But if you were a white guy trying to support a family of four, yeah, 1965 was probably a pretty good time. At least taken on its own terms. If you wanted to raise two kids in a 2-bedroom apartment, have one car, one telephone, one black and white television, that's the other thing, is that we don't think about the living standards that we are supposedly envying. I just had a discussion with someone on social media about an old Twilight Zone episode called Kick the Can, which was, a lot of folks might remember, that's where the old people play kick the can and magically become kids again. And it's a fable about how awful it was to grow old in 1962, before miracle drugs, before Medicare, before, any kind of real state control of nursing home facility. I mean, it was a nightmare. You dreaded growing old. And the only consolation you had is that you were probably going to die by the time you were 70. And yet we look back at this and say, wow, I really wish I could do that again. I am 60 and I grew up in the 1970s. I have no interest in going back to 1975. None.
Yeah,
Zero.
I know.
Zilch.
I know. I'm 66, almost 67 now. Yeah, the 70s, what an awful decade that was. I'm not even sure what the 60s were because I was still kind of a kid. Yeah, you quote Obama's famous speech here. We're fortunate to be living in the most peaceful, most prosperous, most progressive era in human history. That may surprise young people who are watching TV or looking at your phones, and it seems like only bad news comes through every day, but consider that it's been decades since the last war between major powers, and then he goes on and on about all the things that you talk about there. And you, then quoting you on your opening pages here, the citizens of the world's democracies are living in a time of peace and plenty that is unimaginable a half century ago. The increases in living standards, even in my own adult lifetime, are stunning. And I'd like to think that I'm not that old. You're not. You're a youngster. Had anyone said 40 or 50 years ago that everything from energy to clothing would be cheaper and better, that food would be so plentiful, that we wouldn't know what to do with most of it, that the Soviet Union would vanish peacefully and that we would dismantle tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, or that diseases once struck fear into us were curable, most people would have burst out laughing at such utopianism. Yet, here we are. So what's the problem? I mean, your book is kind of like we have this issue, this problem, this, threat on democracy. You're kind of portraying this like, hey, we do have a problem here, even though you've just said things are great.
Well, I think part of the problem is that we have a problem because things are great. And because things have advanced so rapidly. When you and I were kids, Michael, we did not envy our parents, because we knew how they grew up. And, we didn't want to live through the Depression again. But also, I didn't want to live, when my father would talk to me nostalgically about not having a car and taking the streetcar everywhere for 5 cents, taking the streetcar to school, I didn't, he spoke of that, very gently, because we all love our childhoods to some extent. But I thought, wow, that seems really backward to me. And I think now you have, and I could see it. I mean, I grew up and I could see where the trolley tracks had been, and I could see the facade of where the old movie theater had been. I think now we have generations of people who have no memory of things being any worse than they really, or better than they really are. That we live in a very long present now. When my younger students, because I teach undergraduates at night, when they would say to me, well, professor, you just don't understand, because of course that's always the thing that they say to older professors, you don't understand. These are the worst times ever. And I would say, all right, how many people here know what the words, have ever heard the word stagflation? And, a few hands would go up and they say, now, how many people know what stagflation means? And all the hands would come down. And I'd say, it means high unemployment, high inflation, and low economic growth all happening at the same time, which until the 1970s, economists thought was impossible. And I lived through it. And they kind of just look at me and say, but how bad could that have been?
Well,
and I'm like, well, when you're 18 and you graduate from high school and the unemployment rate is 10%, it's pretty bad. And I think we've just gotten used to a certain standard of living and a certain level of performance, coupled with the notion that when things go wrong in our lives, it is not just a failure of a government or a policy or bad luck or economic conditions. It's a failure of the democratic system itself. And therefore, we have to trash it and replace it with people who are going to give us what we want and hurt the people that we don't like. And that you can't sustain a democracy on that.
So your argument is that in the long run, the trend lines are positive. There's more liberal democracies than there's ever been, if you say the last 100 years. But maybe this is a little blip. You have Orban in Hungary and the Kims in North Korea and Iran and Iraq issues there and so forth. But that used to be very common, those kinds of dictatorships and autocracies, and there's fewer of them. But we have to pay attention because there's no laws of history that lead us inevitably to this moral arc. It's that we have to fight for it. So when someone like Tucker Carlson goes to Hungary and says, "Oh my God, this Orban guy's great. I mean, this is a total democracy, and they have civil rights, and they're a serious country. They actually enforce their borders, unlike us," you would say what?
Well, first, I wrote the book because I want this to be a short blip and not the end of liberal democracy. And to people like Carlson, first of all, I don't take people like Carlson seriously because he doesn't really care what kind of system emerges in the United States, because being fantastically wealthy and protected, he'll be fine no matter what it is. Either he will be on the right side of the regime, in which case he will be honored and given power, or he'll be on the wrong side of the regime, in which case he'll go to his summer home in Maine and dig a moat and not bother anybody. So, the hypocrisy of the people who call for political violence and who admire repressive systems, it's nauseating. But what I would say to people who actually believe this stuff is not to let your dissatisfaction with the outcomes of democratic systems, which can be bad. I mean, we've had stupid leaders and bad politicians and dumb policies. That's part of being in a government and being a democratic government. But if you're going to throw away the entire constitutional system and decide that, a strong man is the way to go, and repressing the rights of others is how to get what you want, then it really is a matter of be careful what you ask for, because the people who usually vote for that or choose that, it doesn't take long for them to figure out that they're not actually going to be on the beneficiaries of that. Authoritarian leaders and claques don't really like sharing power with anybody, and they do a lot of sucking up to the average person to get what they want until they have the power they want, and then they will throw you away and grind you under their wheels, just like their opponent. In fact, sometimes authoritarian systems turn on their allies faster than they turn on their opponents, because those are the real competitors for power.
So would you say Trump is not a Republican? He's not a conservative. He's his own thing, whatever that is. It's sometimes you hear the words populism or authoritarian populism, and economic nationalism. I don't know. How do you think about what happened that last 4 years?
The thing that's so interesting about the Trump phenomenon is how much it resembles the Brexit movement, the five-star movement in Italy, the collapse of democracy in Turkey and Poland and Hungary and Brazil and other places, in that it was not an uprising of the poor and the dispossessed and the forgotten men and women. It was a bored middle class looking for entertainment, looking for gladiator games. These were people yelling for bread and circuses. And Trump is probably the stupidest human being ever to be president, but he had one real talent, and that is marketing. I mean, I give Donald Trump credit. He is a marketing genius. He can slap his name on anything. I mean, this guy could slap his name on a cinder block and sell it to somebody in a swimming pool. But he what he really promised was revenge for all of the resentful feelings that you have. If you felt like you didn't get that promotion at work, Trump was the guy that was going to really stick it to the people you hated. You're living in a house with, a rundown kitchen and not like that person on TV with the granite countertops. Trump's going to get even with them. I had people say to me and to people like me in the Never Trump movement, they said, when Trump's in, you're going to be out. And I would say, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to be fired when Donald Trump becomes president. I'm not going to be, you're not going to expropriate my pension and, seize my lands. And I mean, that's not how anything works in the real world. But Trump sold them this notion of social revenge. And I think this is where we have to talk about race, because Trump's audience overwhelmingly were middle class, relatively prosperous, white middle class men. And yes, he had Latino supporters. Yes, he had women who voted for him. But the driver here was this notion that you guys have been screwed by democracy. And this is the same. In the book, I talk about Thomas Frank looking at Kansas in the 1990s. It's exactly the same problem that happens in the what's the matter with Kansas question, which is you have people in Kansas saying, I am so mad about being in Kansas, I'm going to vote against all those liberals and elect people that are literally going to grind my town into powder and plow over it. If that's how I have to make you mad about not feeling like you don't respect me, then I'm going to vote for somebody who's literally going to just burn my city down. It's insane, and it's counterproductive to them. But that's what Trump promised. Trump was finally the vehicle, said, I will make everybody you hate mad. And again, I keep coming back to it. You can't sustain a democracy on just voting to see how much you can piss everybody else off. At some point, you have to vote for something. And the people who voted for Trump got nothing. They got big deficits. They got tax cuts for the rich. They got the collapse of, these Potemkin projects in like Wisconsin and Lordstown and other places that all fell apart despite Trump's promises. And in the end, they didn't care. They just wanted to go and shout at people that they think are different from them and that they don't like. That turns out about as well as you'd expect.
Own the libtards is the phrase.
Well, and it's strange, Go ahead, Michael. I'm sorry.
No. It's just, I think in your book you had that example of the guy that said, I'd rather not have health care for myself if it means that these illegal immigrants or other people can't have it. So in a way, what they're saying is I have prioritized these moral issues that I identify myself as or define myself as over and above my own personal interests.
Right. I've prioritized pride and narcissism and ego to the point where I'd rather die than ever admit I was wrong. And, that story, which comes from Jonathan Metzel's book called Dying of Whiteness, the guy involved he admits his liver's shot from years of partying, brought this on him. He says point blank, did it to himself. He's broke, has been poor his whole life. He says, I don't want my tax money paying for them. And it's like, dude, you've never paid taxes in your life. What are you talking about? Where do you get this notion that you are providing all this largesse, to other people? And I think part of it is this kind of nativistic howl or this just aggrieved yawp, in part because they feel they're looked down upon by people who really don't think about them very much at all. And in the book, I attribute part of this to the proximity between us all that's been created by social media and by the internet and by cable television, because it didn't used to be that people in, Ohio spent a lot of time really caring what anybody in San Francisco thought. But now they do. And that people like Carlson and the guys on Fox News, they just keep pushing that every day of these people in San Francisco don't like you. Where I grew up, as you can tell, I don't even have a Boston accent. It was like, we were the western half of the state. We had the area code that identified us as bumpkins. In Massachusetts, you had to be 617 or you were, rubes like us in 413. And we didn't sit around thinking about, what are they thinking about us in Boston? Right. We were kind of we were a Red Sox Yankees neighborhood. We were split evenly on that. But now people spend a huge amount of time obsessing about what other people think of them, to the point where they'll say, if it sticks it to those liberals somewhere far away from me, I will literally die of liver cancer.
Yeah, my next big book is on conspiracy theories and why people believe them. And so I opened the book with that guy in the rotunda with the Confederate flag on January 6th, walking across there. And I just asked, what is this guy thinking? And we now know who he is. He wrote a letter to his daughters. I'm going in because this is what we got to do, or whatever. Or it was with his son, I think. And they proudly display the Confederate flag at their home and so on. And he's going in. So the question, so I'll just ask you, what were these people thinking they were going to do? I mean, they're in there taking selfies. They couldn't. This isn't their 1776 moment, as one of them said. You're not John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, having thought through this thing for years, and then write 100 Federalist Papers to justify why you're doing everything and all that. This is just, I don't know what it is.
And you're not John Adams being oppressed by an actual British king who is, expropriating your fortunes and sending troops to be quartered in your house. I think the January 6th people were the kind of poster children of the aggrieved, childish narcissism that has seized our culture. And I'm tempted to say has seized our culture on both sides, but I think that the right has really weaponized it into an authoritarian, really seriously anti-democratic culture. And it's interesting, you've got people that have no connection to the Confederacy walking around with Confederate flags because it's tribal signification. It's like, oh, I hate the United States because, Joe Biden's president, so I'm going to carry the stars and bars. Well, that's not only treasonous, it's stupid. It's just dumb, because that's not what the stars and bars were about. And but again, it becomes like, well, I'll wear a red hat, I'm going to carry a Confederate flag. And I think they had no idea what they were going to do when they got there, because they have no idea how their own government works. What they were really saying is, my life is not interesting enough. My life, I am sitting there being jacked up every night by being on Facebook or watching Fox or, watching OANN or listening to talk radio. And when I look around me, I see an ordinary life. And for most Americans, an ordinary life was its own reward. I live in an America that is peaceful, prosperous, united, that, I have a family, I can go fishing, I have a dog, I have a daughter or son. Now it's, no, I have to be Tony Stark. I have to be Captain America. And I'm only partly kidding here, Michael, because, we're talking about this childish culture. It's not an accident that and I say this as somebody who loves crappy superhero movies, and I play video games, and I'm kind of an I love being an adult who likes kid stuff, but having my own credit card, which is the best of all worlds. But 20 years, the major movies in America, the biggest moneymakers, are all superhero fantasies. Yeah. And I think that says something about our culture, that people say, you know what? Country screwed up. You know who's going to take care of it? Me. That's who. I'm going to Washington. I'm going to smear poop on the walls to show that I'm like James Madison somehow. And I think it has become, we have a prosperous working and middle class that cannot accept that life is about going to work, taking care of your kids, walking your dog, put some gas in your tank. That's it. That's life for most people. And they just can't accept that. Like, life has to be heroic and emotional and supercharged and interesting. And you mentioned Carlson. I mean, if you sit and watch, as I will often do, because I'm a social scientist and I pay attention to what my fellow citizens are doing. If you sit and watch 4 hours of Fox from 7 to 11 p.m., you won't even be able to sleep. I mean, by the time it's over, it's just nothing but rage just pouring through your eyeballs, with visual propaganda and people yelling at you through the television and, warning you and that everybody's coming to get you. And I mean, it's insane. I should probably add, you asked about my background, and then I'll shut up about this, but I was I turned 18 in 1978 and I registered as a Republican in Massachusetts.
You did?
Where there was this very reasonable old school Republican Party, Ed Brooke and the New England Republicans, Olympia Snow and, folks like that. Even now, Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts, one of the most popular governors in America, is a Republican, at least nominally a Republican. And, I was a Republican for a long time. But it was always this kind of confident, optimistic republicanism. And when I watch this stuff now, it's this terrifying bombardment of fear triggers that are just nuts. I mean, it's not even a right-left issue anymore. It's like literally, and I started to say, I used to watch Fox. I'd say, oh, well, here's a conservative-leaning channel. Not always my cup of tea. Didn't like Glenn Beck, those kind of, weirdo guys. But I stopped watching it when one night I was sitting there and I just found myself saying, that's wrong. And that's wrong. And that's false. And that's really false. And that's intentionally false. And finally, I just said, why am I watching this when my brain is just fact checking this every 10 minutes? And so I started watching the local news, national news, CNN, MSNBC, all the other nets. And then after a year or two, I kind of tuned back in and I said, oh my God, this isn't even just wrong. This is now flaming hot craziness. And you can't make rational decisions about politics when you are literally like with an electrode jammed into your neck, just feeding you all of these jolts of anger and fear over and over again. And that's everywhere now. I mean, it's just, throughout the media environment, particularly on the right, especially on the right.
Yeah, last year I launched the Skeptic Research Center through Skeptic magazine, which we have nonpartisan data collection. Two of my former grad students, now professors, do this surveys and statistics for a living. And so anyway, we've conducted a bunch of studies throughout 2020 and into 2021. And one of our findings was that everybody distorts the number of African Americans that are killed by police every year. Predictably, because of the availability heuristic, what you see on the news, it seems like it goes on all the time. So, but by like orders of magnitude, like 1,000 are killed every year, or 10,000 are killed. But then we also found that liberals distort that more than conservatives, right? So next thing I know, I see Tucker Carlson reporting this the next day with our graph up on his screen. I'm like, oh my God, Fox News is paying attention to our little Skeptic Research Center. So I contacted the producer through some friends that know them. And they go, oh, yeah, this is incredible research. And, we should have you on and so on. I said, well, yeah, OK, that'd be great. We also found that conservatives distort, other things, findings we've made about conservatives distorting, like how many abortions or how many immigrants are coming in and, those kinds of causes. And they're like, yeah, we'll call you. And
we'll get back to you.
We'll get back to you. And same thing, and Tucker has this thing about the UAPs and UFOs. I'm not sure why he's totally into this. And again, this is another thing we do at Skeptic all the time. It's like, there's another side to this. And I call the producer, I can present you with all the, what scientists think that they are. Yeah, we'll get back to you. It's like, I never heard from him again. It's like, I knew that it was like this, but then when you hear it, you see it right there in front of you. It's like, come on, man.
This is something that you wish you could tell a Fox viewer to say, they will call up. And when you say, but I have this other stuff, they say, no, thanks. We won't be having that. I mean, you said, why is Tucker into all this UAP and UFO stuff? He's not. Tucker Carlson is a highly educated man. He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows that there's a bunch of rubes who believe this stuff, and it keeps their eyeballs glued to Tucker Carlson. Carlson was once friends with David Frum, and David Frum summed him up perfectly. He said, Tucker likes money and he likes being on TV. And that's it. That's what he's doing. He's going to be on TV and he's going to make money. And that's the goal. You were talking about things people exaggerate. I mean, in the book, I point out you literally can't have a rational conversation with people about school safety and shooter drills. You just can't. And when you say schools are actually safer than they were in the 90s, people say that's impossible. And I'm like, well, you can get mad at me, but you're arguing with math. You're literally arguing with like mathematics. And they say, but I see, and as you say, it's an availability heuristic. And this is part of it that is we're doing pretty well at bashing Fox and the right wing. There is a nonpartisan element to this, which is that the old media rule of if it bleeds, it leads, disasters always play better than good news. Modern media has amped that up so that everything that happens anywhere happens to you, and it happens immediately, and you experience it in real time. And this is not healthy. This is constantly jolting your fight or flight mechanism in your head. I was watching, I think, CNN one day, and there was something about a bus accident in like Canada. And I was like, well, that's terrible. And it went on, and we have cameras, and we're dwelling on it, and then we think there were some children, and maybe there's a couple, and I'm like, this is not to be callous about other human lives, but this was a local story 25 years ago. This was like the little sidebars in a newspaper, which of course, to refer to the size of something in a newspaper now makes no sense because people don't read papers. But this would have been around the region or around the world item. But now you're sitting there saying, my God, where was this? Are these kids okay? What's going on? And instead of taking in information and just living your life every day, you are grabbed by the lapels and you are forced to stare at this terrifying thing that isn't happening to you and not remotely happening. Meanwhile, we have a war going on for 20 years in Afghanistan, and people are like, that's boring.
Right.
Don't want to see it. Don't want to put it on television.
Yeah, you mentioned David Frum. I think of Bill Kristol also. I read all their work, and older conservatives like Charles Krauthammer and George Will. I've read everything they've written. I'm not a conservative, but I really respect those guys, and I feel like we need them. We need them to kind of keep the left from going too far left, just like we need this slightly left of center Democrats to keep the right from going too far right, and so on. But it seems like now it's so polarized, and we know from graphs, you see the center has shrunk and the number of people self-identifying as far right or far left has increased. So how do we think about, well, I wore for you today my shirt, my classical liberal shirt. I wear my political beliefs on my shirt. It's almost like the people we've been talking about, the Fox News and Carlson's, they're really arguing against not liberals, not classical liberals, but illiberals, far left, progressives, sometimes called the regressive left. And, right. Again, just, Carlson and his weekly campus craziness episodes that he used to have, or now Antifa. Look at these people looting the CVS in Seattle or the Starbucks in Portland. This is what the liberals are giving you. It's like, those aren't liberals. That's not liberalism. So how do you think about that kind of spectrum of illiberal, liberal, and conservative, old school, and whatever Trump and those people are?
I really, I've taken a lot of accusations that I'm, I was conservative for a long time, and now I'm this, traitor, sellout, shill, grifter, opportunist. My answer is I haven't changed my views at all. I shouldn't say that. I've changed some of my views considerably, but that, the idea that somehow I've become a liberal, I get hate mail all the time and say, leftists like you. And I'm like, the liberals who know me would burst out laughing at the notion that I'm a leftist. I miss the days when we lived for policy, because we all accepted the constitutional order as the arena in which we fought. So that, the other day I did a show with Leslie Marshall, who's from our hometown area here. And, we were kind of laughing about, there was once a day, Leslie Marshall and I, if politics ever returned to normal, she and I would fight like cats and dogs about tax rates, about national defense, about, religious freedom, about, women's right, whatever. We'd have big fights about what's the role of the state, how many laws should be passed, how much should we spend. That's all gone away. We live in a post-policy world now where people really don't care about policy. They care about sticking it to the other team. You really see this in the way people have turned on a dime. And again, mostly on the right. The same people that say, well, I was in the Tea Party about big deficits, and then Trump blows up the deficit and gives giant tax cuts to, the top 0.010%. they say, well, that's okay. He's my guy. But you do see, you see some of it on the left. It's like, we're all about free speech. Well, unless it's speech we don't like. We're all about, the national government telling what states to do. Unless Trump's running the national government, then we're all about federalism and small government and local control all of a sudden. I think there are two major political movements in America now. People who are on the side of the constitutional order, on the side of traditional small L liberal values, tolerance, secularism, reason, debate, cooperation. And then there's the illiberal movement that says, I want government to just be a big hammer that's held by people I like and screw the rest of you. That's it to me. And so I have made common cause with people that are to my right in some cases. There are some disaffected evangelicals who have spoken out against this, who I'm Greek Orthodox. Evangelicalism is a mystery to me. But that I find myself agreeing with people that I probably didn't have a lot of interaction with before, like say Pete Wehner or David French. But I'm also making common cause with people on the far left. Who say, well, we don't agree about policy, but we agree about the rules of the game and the constitutional order. And that's it. To me, those are the only two parties that are left in America right now. And the Democrats are not perfect, and they have a very childish, almost totalitarian streak among some of their far left elements. But they're not in charge. And I think the Democratic Party, I'm not a Democrat. I am unhomed now.
You are?
But I think that a coalition among those forces is the only thing we can do now.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that. You're Greek Orthodox. None of that comes out in your books. So that's interesting. You've kind of kept that out. Do you think for a liberal democracy,
I don't think that the history of our dissents with the Catholics over the Filioque clause were going to make compelling reading. So I kind of sort of left that aside.
Well, here I'm just kind of hearkening back to the founding fathers and the idea that, well, if we're going to have a self-governing people, they need an internal self-governor. And that was, at the time, religion. Religion, it's kind of an argument, even though Jefferson and these guys were mostly deists. They recognize that religion plays an important role, even though we want to keep it out of government, and vice versa, separation of church and state. But people need some kind of internal.
I'm sorry to interpose for a minute. Not just religion, but remember, the founders were all classically educated, and the notion of an internal governor is also Aristotle. And these guys knew all that. They kind of said, look, there is a thing called virtue. It is inherent in human beings. And Madison, who I quote in the book, said, when he's asked about how do we put in these laws and how do we, people are saying, but what if? And he says, look, you cannot, he says, if we are not a virtuous people, we're screwed. He says, I assume that virtuous people will elect virtuous people. And then he says what I think is just a classic line. He says, is there no virtue among us? If not, then we are in a wretched situation. And I think that's where we're headed now.
Interesting.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, it's not just religion. For Jefferson, it was also Aristotle and Plato and the classics, and they were all schooled in that.
Yes, I've been reading the Federalist Papers, as you do during a pandemic. Actually, they're all on audio. You can get them on audio tape and just listen to them when you're driving or whatever. Yeah, the level of writing and thinking is just beyond belief that any politician today would write something that deep and thoughtful, but mainly grounded in human nature. Madison's point, this is what people are like. If they can get more power, they'll take as much as they get. So ambition must be made to counter ambition and so forth. And if men were angels, we wouldn't need government and so forth. And, that all seems to ring true. So I'm glad you made that point about it. It doesn't have to be traditional religion. It could just any internal governing morality to kind of attenuate our inner demons and accentuate our better angels. That's what good governance is about, and some of that has to come from within. So that would be the basis of a secular government. That is to say, it doesn't matter where the source is, but you need that. So this brings me to the subject of spreading democracy around the world, which we've just seen is not going to happen in Afghanistan, probably not in Iraq. And the question is, why is that? So I'll just, by way of background, my own thinking on this. I used to be more of an isolationist than I heard George W. Bush say he read Nathan Sharansky's book, The Case for Democracy. So I read Sharansky's book, and I thought, yeah, this guy makes a good argument that in part saying some people are not ready for democracy is kind of a racist, bigoted thing to say. It's like, this isn't rocket science. Come on. Anybody could figure this out. And so you can't argue, well, these people are too dumb to be ready for democracy. But that not quite his argument. And I think what we've seen, like Amy Chua makes this point in her book on tribalism, that a country that's grounded in so much tribalism, a liberal democracy requires kind of a collective action on the part of all of us are going to do this thing, have this election, we're going to follow these rules that are in our Constitution and so on. And you can't be too tribal. So, of course, one of the things Madison was talking about in the Federalist Papers is, we have these 13 different states. They're like 13 nation states, and we have to somehow put that aside, at least in some parts, for these collective things, just like canals or a navy or something like that. So let's just talk about Afghanistan. Why did that fail? Why did our nation building, let's bring democracy to other countries like that? Why did that not work? And is it possible some countries really are not ready for democracy because of that tribalism?
I think we're phrasing the question too artificially in too binary of a way, because it is kind of racist to say, well, nobody's ready. There are people who aren't ready for democracy. Yeah, I think there has to be a certain level of development before a human being can actually undertake the trust, for example, that democracy requires, to say, if I lose this election, there will be another election. That if other people are administering the affairs of government, it's not going to mean I'm going to die. With that said, no one wants to be a slave. Everybody believes in democracy. The question is, do they believe in democracy for anybody but themselves? The tribes love democracy when it's within their tribe. They just don't want anybody else to have it. They just don't want any other tribes to have a say. And so, why does the democracy project fail? Well, first, I think you have to go back to the way Americans conceive of it, because we were facing for 50 years during the Cold War a malignant system that was literally like cancer, that it was trying to expand into every space it could go to, and rot those governments out and turn them into clients or puppets of the Soviet Union. And of course, I can hear liberal listeners saying, well, the Americans tried to do that too. Well, I'll tell you what, if you'd rather, in the big competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, I would rather have been dealing with the Americans, even in their worst day, than what the Soviets were doing, because they had a global revolutionary project and they said so. The difference between the Americans and the Soviets is the Americans occasionally. I don't want to go into relitigating the Cold War. Bottom line is, there are a lot of places where when the Cold War was over, the Americans said, we're not going to keep propping up dictatorships. We're not going to keep supporting these odious, police states. We're going to let Marcos fall. We're going to take out Noriega and so on. But then we couldn't get past the Cold War notion that every country in the world has to be democratic so that we can be safe. This Kantian notion that only liberal democracies can make us safe. It's almost like the war between Athens and Sparta, where for 27 years, these two Greek city-states, every time they conquered a place, they literally rooted their own system of government there, because it was the only kind of government they were comfortable with. I really wanted to believe, I didn't think it was possible in Afghanistan. I thought it was more possible in Iraq, which is a has a strong middle class, developed country. I'm not willing to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I never thought Afghanistan was going to become a, functioning democratic system in my lifetime. I thought we would just have to stay there and police it to prevent it from becoming a terrorist threat. And I think Biden was right to finally just pull the plug after 20 years. But I don't think that the Americans should give up on the notion that we oppose authoritarian governments and we support democratic governments. We should be turning the screws on Belarus every chance we get. I'm sorry that, people will say, well, who cares about Belarus? Well, I care about Belarus. And there's a lot of things the United States government can do to say, no, the kind of government you've become, that you are in Belarus, you do not get treated like a normal country by the United States. And that doesn't mean changing things with force. The United States has a lot of power at its disposal of various kinds. And I don't want people in a democracy to say, well, everything is just too hard, and so screw it. Let's be like China and just make deals with awful people. I mean, that's partly what we did during the Cold War out of necessity. We did terrible things during the Cold War because we felt we had to. We don't have to do that anymore. So let's not do that anymore. But let's not forget that our principles are part of our national culture and our heritage. And yes, our principles are part of our national interests. One of the things I really objected to about Trump and foreign policy was that pure transactionalism that said, what's good for us is good for us. And if we make a deal with North Korea or China and it's good for them, it's good for us, who cares, what that leads to down the line? I think that's just stupid, and it's basically evil as a foreign policy. So I want us to have I want us to return to the enlightened Wilsonian kind of, we are friends of liberty, even when we can't, help you directly. We will do everything we can, and we are on your side because we want there to be more democracies and fewer authoritarian systems in the world.
Was there a better way to end the Afghan war than what we just went through the last 2 weeks? Would Trump have done it any differently, since he said he wanted to get out of there too?
I think it's never a good idea to ask how Trump would have done something, because Trump's voter base doesn't care how he did anything. I think Biden had the right policy, but I think my guess when all this is over is that Biden was tired of hearing the national security bureaucracy and the Pentagon and state and everybody else saying, you can't do it. You can't do it right now. You can't do it right now. And Biden just said, look, I don't care what happens. Do it right now. Well, the old expression, if you want it done in the worst way, you're going to get it done in the worst way. And I'm not going to say this was the worst way, but it was a mess. I mean, it was just a mess that we're seeing today. A lot of Afghan interpreters and other people who helped us been left behind. We keep taking credit for 120,000 people that we got out, when in fact we didn't actually move those people. We were just there at the airport as they came through. I think we bungled a lot about which sequencing of bases to close and which assets we gave up too early. And, it was never going to go well. You can't evacuate a country in defeat and have it go well. But I think it could have been done better than this. But I think people are also confusing that criticism with, should we have? Every time I say this, I wrote a piece about it in the Atlantic, and I wrote one in USA Today, and people sent me notes. But it was the right thing to do. I'm not arguing it wasn't the right thing to do. I'm saying it could have been done better.
What about the argument that,
well, how would you have done it? And I said, I would have started a year ago or 8 months ago when I came into office, instead of waiting until summer and saying, no, I'm really serious. Just do it tomorrow. And I think that people will see that there were errors that are not even evident right now, because that's going to be the nature of hearings and testimony and memoirs and other things that will come out. But I'm glad Biden did it, and I'm not going to change my vote for Joe Biden the next time around and vote for a Republican because of this. I think but I think we have to be able to talk about these things like adults.
What about the argument that what was wrong with leaving, say, 2,500 troops in there just to kind of help keep the peace, protect some rights of women, and so on? Apparently, we have troops still in South Korea and Germany and Japan and so on. A lot more than, say, 2,500 troops. Why not just declare peace and we say we won, and then leave 2,500 troops there forever?
I never had a problem with kind of an imperial outpost or whatever we'd want to call it, a fire base in Afghanistan that just, keeps the Taliban out of the cities and away from ruling the country. But the reality is, the reason we can't do it is because the American people made it clear that they don't want to do that. And I think as citizens in a democracy, a majority of the folks have a right to say, look, this war went on for 20 years and we want it to end. What I object to are the people now saying, well, I wanted us to get out, but I didn't know it would be so ugly and that the Taliban's going to run the place and now they're going to be thrown. I'm like, again, the way adults talk about choices is there is risk. There is risk in staying. There will be casualties. It will be expensive. It requires an ongoing commitment. If you don't want to do that, that's actually agree with that. It's time not to do that anymore. But you have to accept risk in the other direction now, which is this gigantic ungovernable space is going to be more or less run by a bunch of terrorists. And other terrorist groups are going to be running around loose in there. And that raises some risk to the United States. It's not like, a 9/11 level risk again. But it's okay to say, look, I accept that risk, but I want to get out. I think Biden is getting unfairly hammered for, particularly from the Republicans, is we want it to get out and we want it to be with no risk and we want everything to be okay. Well, that's not the real world. That's like saying you can have, there's only 2 ice cream machines in this shop and there's vanilla and there's chocolate, and you can bitch about how much you want strawberry, but there isn't any strawberry. That's not a choice. So pick one and live with it the way, adults in the real world have to pick one and live with it. And I give Biden credit. He picked one and he's going to live with it. And, whatever the costs are, he said he's going to accept those. And I think that's admirable. I don't think it's admirable to say, get this done and believe all the happy talk about, what was going to happen. The withdrawal, I think, was a mess. But okay, it's over. It's time to move on.
Yeah, I think people that have decried the end of his presidency and he'll never get reelected forget how fast these things disappear from memory. 2 years from now, no one will be talking about Afghanistan. Hell, 6 months from now, they probably won't be.
Well, that's like talking about... Yeah, I mean, first of all, the American public just doesn't care about foreign policy, which is unfortunate. And I say that not with any approval, but as an empirical reality. The American public just doesn't care about this stuff. Remember, Reagan presided over 240 Marines getting killed in Beirut. And by 1984, it was like, that was a year later. It was like, oh, yeah, that. And it was gone. Now it's seared into the memory of Marines, and others who were there. But the American public just, they just moved on. And I think that's unfortunate. I'm a national, when I was still a Republican, I was a national security Republican. I worked for John Hines in the Senate, the very model of a moderate Republican that I could work for. I was his national security guy. I was his defense and foreign policy guy. So for me, I vote on foreign policy, but I understand that 99% of Americans just don't care about it. They don't pay attention to it.
Yeah, I think they just don't know much about it. Again, distortions of how much money we spend overseas. It's not that much compared to what people think it is. But I had John Mueller on the podcast last year. John Mueller.
Talk to people about foreign aid.
Yeah. They think, it's like 10%.
So talk to people about foreign aid, and it's hilarious.
Yeah. Right? Don't they think we spend like 10% of our GDP on foreign aid or something? It's like 0.01%. It's just nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I actually wrote about this in The Death of Expertise, where the polling data is like most people think we spend somewhere between 5 and 15% of our GDP, but there is actually a non-trivial amount of people who think it's a quarter of our GDP, and of the budget rather of the U.S. budget, and there are people who literally think we spend 50% of our budget on foreign aid. Of course, the reality is we spend less than 1%. We spend a fraction of a percent on foreign aid, but people believe what they want to believe about foreign policy. You said that they don't know much about it. I would add to that, they don't want to know much about it. I mean, they will actively resist it. They won't read about it. I was on a panel with Dan Baltz from the Washington Post a while back, and someone said, why don't you publish more explainers of these complicated policies? And Baltz didn't blink an eye. He said, we publish them. You won't read them. We know you don't read them.
Right.
We know what pages you're landing on, on the web, and nobody will read these long explainers. They bore you. I'm not sure what you can do about that.
It's like these reports I get from Cato Institute and Reason magazine about like privatization of airports or, just the distribution of water issues or whatever. And my eyes just glaze over. It's like, oh God, I know this is important, but I just can't get my mind into it. I wanted to ask you about John Mueller's book, The Stupidity of War. I had him on the podcast last year or when his book came out. And, he argues that most wars are not really justified. They're really bad wars. The exceptions being the Revolutionary War for Independence, Civil War, and slavery. World War II to end fascism, maybe parts of the Cold War, but even there, this is just a massive waste of time, resources, money, and so forth. And furthermore, this whole, security theater business, terrorism is an existential threat. How is it possible to be an existential threat, he says, and so on. And then we get ourselves mired in these, 20-year wars because of this, the security theater business. And we should just mind our own business and stay out of all this, unless it's really, really massively threatening. Another Hitler level threat.
Well, I think Mueller sets up a gigantic straw man and ignites it with barrels of gasoline, because who's going to say that most wars aren't stupid? Human beings killing each other is one of the most grievous and terrible things we do. And in fact, we have a whole body of thought called the just war approach that came mostly out of Catholic Christian thought in the Middle Ages, because taking other human lives in war was considered this grievous sin that you had to think through before you really could undertake it with any sense of justice. So, I'm not going to disagree with him. I mean, the wars of the Spanish Succession, nobody's going to defend that. Even some of the Cold War, escapades where people got killed over, there was a Soviet historian of the Vietnam War, a really smart guy named Ilya Gaiduk, who said, it's fantastic to think that we were confronting each other in these places. A Soviet ambassador who added to that, in places that only historians can name now. But there's a couple of things I would warn people about in thinking about this. First of all, it's easy to judge in hindsight. As David McCullough said, remember, people living back then didn't know they were living back then. To say that, well, everybody should have known in 1965 that Vietnam was stupid and that we were going to win the Cold War and the Soviet Union was going to go away, that's pretty easy, retro engineering. You hear Johnson talking to Richard Russell at one point saying, Vietnam's not worth anything to this country. He said, but we have a treaty with this country, and the communists are the kind of people that will chase you right into your kitchen if you don't oppose them. So these were not guys sitting around saying, hey, where can we send young men? These people were agonizing over it, and these are very human decisions. And I want to remind people, imagine saying in 1975, after the fall of Saigon, the United States is flat on its ass economically. Oil prices are, rampaging our economy. NATO is being held together with chewing gum at this point. Imagine saying, listen, it's going to be okay. In 15 years, the Soviet Union is going to completely collapse. Americans are going to have the strongest economy in the world. We're going to be a net exporter of oil and fossil products. People would have said, what are you, nuts? Are you out of your mind? That's not even, remember, in the 1970s, we all thought we'd be sitting here by now eating Soylent Green, that we'd all be starving to death, and bargaining with each other for gallons of water. And so I think it's really important to not get too snotty about decisions that were made 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. The other is it ever okay to fight? And I think the classic response to Mueller is there's a line in a movie called The Good Shepherd, which is a kind of fictionalized history of the CIA. And in it, a mobster says to the CIA, he says, you're the guys that scare me. You're the guys that really do these big wars. And the CIA guy shrugs and he says, no, we're the ones that make sure they're little wars. Or that they stay small. And I think there are times when, you're going to exercise military force so that you're not stuck with a Hitler level threat. Now, on this, I will say, I agree with Mueller that we turned the war on terror into an existential threat to the United States. And I tried to stamp out that word. I think the existential threat to the United States is anybody who possesses a significant number of nuclear weapons, which I believe is an existential threat to humanity.
Yeah, for sure.
But the idea that Al-Qaeda was going to march into Boston, the Boston Common, or that ISIS was going to hoist the black flag over the Pentagon or something. These were fever dreams, and we got carried away with them. And even I did sometime. After 9/11, I wanted to just, go ahead, send anybody you need into Afghanistan. Is Saddam making nuclear weapons? Let's find out. But I think we need to stop using the word existential for things that are not existential. But again, and I'll just wrap this part of it up to say, we have to get away from this binary switch, which is if it's not existential, then it's nothing. Well, there's a lot in between nothing and stay at home and just ignore the world and fight the last crusade. Because that, as to paraphrase Trotsky, right? War, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And to simply, it's arrogant of us to say, well, we'll just throw up our hands and say, we don't want to do anything with the world. Well, the world may not decide to give us a timeout and let us just go home and fix things. You can't turn off foreign policy or hit a pause button on it because it's become inconvenient to you.
Yeah, one of my concessions to true conspiracy theories is that when you get elected president, they take you in the back room and they go, all right, here's what's actually going on. And you're like, oh no. So like when Obama said, I'm gonna end no first use and launch on warning for nuclear weapons. And then he didn't. Well, why not? Well, because our treaty with NATO says, NATO says you can't do that. We have to be able to have that threat, that sword of Damocles hanging over him, or they're going to invade. And then so he didn't. And I think there's a lot of that kind of thing that goes on that we just don't know about it. And there may be stuff with Afghanistan that in a year or two from now we'll go, oh, I see why he did what he did. And
when I talk to my students about what it's, the things like the president's daily brief, right? And I talk about the difference between running for election and governing. I call the president's daily brief the oh shit book, where, you're standing in a parking lot in Wisconsin or in front of a Walmart in Pennsylvania, or you're, at a street fair in California, and you're making all these, I'm going to do this and I'm going to shut down that. And, and then you get elected and they sit you down and the guy comes in with the daily brief and you look down and you go, oh shit. And suddenly you're confronted with the reality that stuff that you said in front of a supermarket in Ohio is actually probably not a good idea once you're actually running the country. The problem is, and this is where it comes back to my book, the problem is the politicians say these things to us because we want to be told simple things. We have this country. Democracies are always difficult to talk to because we're, it's like herding cats. We're big and unruly. But I think there was a time, even when I was a kid, where the American public had a greater tolerance for nuance and for bipartisan agreement about things like foreign policy or about trade-offs and costs and risks and requirements. And now it's, we want politicians to literally say, as Trump did, I alone can fix it. Elect me and I will get, Trump literally said at one point, I will give you everything you've wanted. Well, if you vote for somebody like that, you're voting like a 9-year-old. No one can give you everything you want. No one can say, I alone can fix it. No one is the great savior. And there were plenty of people on the left who, when Obama was elected, they said, this is it. We're going to, the oceans will recede. The world will be at peace. The clouds shall part. We have to stop thinking this way. We are the people who affect change. We, the voters,
he got the Nobel Peace Prize. Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize
before he did a thing.
Yeah.
Yes,
that's hope.
That was inane. Look, I don't hate Barack Obama. I think he was actually. I don't think he'll make the ranks of great presidents, but he was a decent president. He was all right. But giving somebody a Nobel Peace Prize just for existing is a fundamentally unserious thing.
Do you think there's any way to get?
And we've become an unserious planet that way.
Do you think there's any way to get to nuclear zero? Since you've written about this, you have a book. To give the proper title of your no use nuclear weapons and U.S. national security. Are we always going to be stuck with the security dilemma, the Hobbesian trap that I want to get rid of them, but the other guy is not going to get rid of his? And or somebody else may build them that we don't like, so we got to have them. Is there any way around that?
I don't think so, but I don't think we can get to global zero, but I think we can get to global very low. So that if somebody gets off the handle, that we end up, having to deal with dozens or hundreds of nuclear explosions instead of thousands of them. And I mean, that's a really low bar to set, but it's the difference between recovery and extinction, I suppose. I think I kind of hope that we can create a taboo around nuclear weapons. And I think there is one, seems to be holding, but kind of like with gas, and germs or biological weapons. I mean, the major powers just don't use gas. I mean, it's just one of those things where they say, listen, we're going to fight with each other and bad things are going to happen. And we're just not going to gas each other. It's just off the table because we don't want to suffer the reciprocation from it. We don't want to deal with the potential of what that does to our own troops. We don't want to have to clean it up later. The United States stopped working on biological weapons back in the 70s, in part because we said, wow, you screw with this stuff, you'd better be good at inventing cures at the same time. And what does this really do for us? It doesn't really have a lot of purpose. I'm hoping we get the same way with nuclear weapons to say, yeah, we probably are going to have to keep these crazy aunties up in the attic somewhere and hope they never get out. But we don't need to build an entire defense posture around, 1,500 thermonuclear weapons that are aimed at 300 cities that will instantly kill, 300 million people in 28 minutes. We can do better than that. I don't know if we can get to zero, but I think we can do better. And look, let's celebrate something. This is one of the few positive things in foreign policy we can talk about. In 1967, the United States had 32,000 nuclear weapons. Now we have, by treaty, about 4,000, but only 1,500 of them are actively deployed. We've got another 3,000 or 4,000 in storage that will never see the light of day again. So we've gone from having 25,000 weapons on active station to 1,500. If you had told me that back in 1984, when I was taking a course at MIT on how nukes work, I would have laughed and I would have said, you're completely high. That's just, you're drinking bong water. But we made it. We did it. We've achieved that. And I honestly, if you had said to me that I would reach the age of 60 years old without seeing somewhere in the world the use of nuclear weapons, 22-year-old me would not have believed you. I just assumed it would have happened by now. So let's chalk one up for the good guys.
All right.
For up till now, anyway.
Yeah, so far. So let's pound on the far left a little bit since we've pounded on the far right. The number one best-selling book in America, the week we're recording this, first week of September, is Mark Levin's American Marxism. And this is the boogeyman, the terrorist, or the existential threat from the far left, the anti-racist movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the whole wokerati. They're going to corrupt your children, the 1619 Project and all that stuff. I've looked at a lot of that. I think, they have some arguments here and there that we should pay attention to. I do think they go too far. What are your thoughts on that as a threat to the future of our democracy?
I feel like, well, first of all, let me just point out that Mark Levin wrote a whole book about Marxism and thinks that the Frankfurt School of political philosophy is the Franklin School, and has no idea what he's talking about. So,
Okay.
Part of the problem is that Americans are getting very spun up about Marxism by people who don't know the first thing about any of the history of this. But I feel like in some ways we're living through a version of 1968 again, with a youth culture and a youth bulge where we're paying way too much attention to what really authoritarian kind of college students want to do with speech codes and cancel culture and, silencing dissent. And it's a real problem. I mean, look, there is I wrote a piece for a conservative journal a while back saying, there is a totalitarian streak on the left, that you can be unpersoned. Now, I don't see it as the same. I think at some point what's going to happen is that whole movement, just like the 60s did, collapses under the weight of its own absurdity after a while. It's one thing to cheer on the students about, yes, show your, fly your colors. And then when the liberal professors start getting canceled, they start looking at each other and saying, this isn't quite what we had in mind about the revolution eating its own. And I think, as it did in the late 60s, people grow up and they become more moderate and understand that life is about shades of gray rather than black and white. And I think that the reaction to it, I think there's a terrible synergy here, because I think the politically correct, what we used to call politically correct, cancel culture, wokeism, whatever you want to call it, whatever label you want to put on it, generated a lot of the support for people like Trump, because he was able to say, look, I will protect you. I will be your champion against, being told that you can't use the wrong pronoun kind of stuff. Some of that was always silly, but he weaponized that very effectively. And a lot of people on the left, look, when Black Lives Matters basically jeered Bernie Sanders off his own stage.
Yeah, I remember that.
There were a lot of Americans who said, if Bernie Sanders isn't left-wing enough to survive a mob challenge, then there's no way I am. And it's just dumb. It's just, and it's foolish politics. But I think now the right's reaction to it is making people on the left dig in to say, in exactly that same way, oh, you think it's stupid to talk about pronouns? Well, my pronouns are she, hers, her. So there, and it's like, again, everybody calm down. We can do this. We can create a more inclusive and gentle and what's the word I'm looking for? A more inclusive and a more understanding and empathetic environment around us, without resorting to this kind of Marxist-Leninist culture, as I often say to people when they say, you admit it, you were once wrong, about it. And I say, listen, I'm not here to do a Marxist-Leninist self-criticism session for the party elders. There is a kind of Chinese cultural revolution streak to some of these movements on the left, where, they're turning to the people that were once on their side and saying, now you must wear paper hats and stand and be shamed. I think it will pass. I think the most powerful force on a lot of these things are parents who, get into the saddle pretty fast when this starts to really affect their children. I think also, again, there's kind of an inherent contradiction in all of that stuff that eventually collapses it under its own weight. But the idea that this is the existential threat to America and not people actually taking power, who are trying to overturn elections, I think has been, on this, I'll give credit to the propagandists on the right who have made you think that Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell are less dangerous than a college student who is addicted to speech codes.
Right.
When, in fact, the people that are actually in Washington governing us and trying to thwart congressional investigations and protect, Trump from impeachment and hide their phone records, and, that these are the people that are really dangerous. But there is a danger on the left. And I think more sensible people in the center left realize that they can't let happen what happened in the late 1960s. And just alienate them. Because the other thing is, the way that you protect democracy is that you win elections and you remain in power to make sure that those constitutional barriers are not pulled down. And, even if people on the left don't agree with me on the substance of some of these issues, my answer to them is, please understand that a lot of this, that defund the police is a stupid political strategy that is going to lose you elections, and the outcome will be far worse than any issues you ever had with policing.
Yeah, I was glad to see Noam Chomsky speak out against that. I don't know if you heard Noam Chomsky's statement about, defund the police. You're just handing it to Fox News. You just gave them the slogan to destroy our arguments.
Imagine the world we live in where I and Noam Chomsky are giving the same advice to the American left.
Yeah, right.
Because I cannot stand Noam Chomsky. I have written pieces about what a fraud I think Noam Chomsky is. But on this, he's right. mark this day that I went on, on a national podcast and I said, hey, that Noam Chomsky guy, he's kind of on the money about this thing, because he understands that you don't get anywhere with slogans and that kind of performative activism that does not then translate into votes and policy and actually legislating and getting things done.
Yeah, there's a lot of social signaling there. I was thinking of the QAnon shaman guy with the Viking horns and the leather jacket and all that stuff. But you see that on the left too. These Antifa dressed up in their black clothes and their masks and all that stuff. It's almost like
balaclavas.
Yeah, it's almost like a cosplay kind of thing. Like this is fun. Well, let me read to you. I kind of wrap it up here, just talking about this sort of need that people have. This is kind of a bizarre side shift here, but this is George Orwell's review of Mein Kampf in the New English Weekly, March 21st, 1940. You've probably seen this before. So here's Orwell. Hitler, because in his own joyless mind he feels it with exceptional strength, knows that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and in general, common sense. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and self-sacrifice, not to mention drums, flags, and loyalty parades. However they may be as economic theories, fascism and Nazism are psychologically far sounder than any hedonistic conception of life. The same is probably true of Stalin's militarized version of socialism. All three of the great dictators have enhanced their power by imposing intolerable burdens on their peoples, whereas socialism and even capitalism, in a more grudging way, have said to the people, I offer you a good time. Hitler has said to them, I offer you struggle, danger, and death. And as a result, a whole nation flings itself at his feet. Perhaps later on they'll get sick of it and change their minds, as at the end of the last war. After a few years of slaughter and starvation, greatest happiness of the greatest number is a good slogan. But at the moment, better an end with horror than a horror without end is a winner. Now that we're fighting against the man who coined it, we ought not to underrate its emotional appeal. I wonder what you think, just in terms of human nature, what people need.
Let me engage in Let me engage in dueling quotations with you and point out that in my book, I note that Eric Hoffer warns us about this back in 1951. He says, if you're worried about the arising of mass movements, unrelieved boredom is a really dangerous warning sign. And he says, that's when people want to have big crusades. And he says, if you take that away from us, you leave our lives puny and meaningless. And, this is why people embark on this is why you have bored real estate agents jumping on charter jets, Instagram herself, rushing the gates of the Capitol, because that's going to be the most exciting thing that's ever happened to her in her entire life. And people kind of crave that. The thing I hope, insofar as I'm nostalgic about anything, I was raised, my father was not perfect. Anybody who reads the books is going to realize my dad was not, wasn't going to win any Father of the Year awards. But my father's notion of heroism was showing up. I mean, I guess I could probably describe the generation of my father and others around him as, what real heroes do? They show up. They show up for work the next morning when they don't want to. They pay for things for their kids that they may not want to, but they know they have to. They mow the lawn or, clean their front porch when they don't want to, but they know that it's the right thing to do. And it used to be that those people derived a great sense of satisfaction from doing ordinary things that were hard. I always think of my mother. The house I grew up in was a dump when we bought it. My mom and dad, were a classic story where I know what month they got married and I know what month I was born. Okay. And they had to find a house, and after living in an apartment, they bought this kind of ramshackle, crappy house on a polluted river. And my mother just took pride in making sure there were flowers in the yard. Didn't cost a lot of money, took a little bit of her time, but she just felt like, what's the point if you don't try to just put some effort out to show up and say, yes, I might live here and it's terrible, but I can plant flowers in the front yard. And to me, that kind of heroism of everyday life, that was once enough for people. And now we have developed this bloated, entitled drama queen narcissism that says, anytime I don't like the way things happen in this country, I'm going to go drive to Washington and say that I have a bomb in my car. I'm going to rush at police officers and beat them with an American flag. That's not heroism. That's not fortitude. That's not strength. That's being a child. That's being a dangerous, armed, muscular child who smashes everything to bits the moment things go wrong.
I love that story in the book about the woman at the on January 6th videotaping herself inside the rotunda and saying, and by the way, if you need a good realtor, it's so funny. Yeah. Here's that.
She says life or death.
Let me read that quote from your book from Eric Hoffer, The True Believer, 1951. Such a classic. There is perhaps no more reliable indicator of a society's ripeness for a mass movement than the prevalence of unrelieved boredom. In almost all the descriptions of the periods preceding the rise of mass movements, there is reference to vast ennui, and in their earliest stages, mass movements are more likely to find sympathizers among the bored than among the exploited and suppressed. To a deliberate fomenter of mass upheavals, the report that people are bored stiff should be at least as encouraging as that they are suffering from intolerable economic or political abuses. And then you follow that with the conservative writer George Will put it more simply in 2020, noting that affluent societies are often gripped by a hunger for apocalypse, a wish for a great struggle. So how do we make democracy a great struggle and exciting?
I was so envious of George's turn of that phrase that I stole it and made it the title of the chapter.
Yeah. It's a great title.
I don't think you can compete with that kind of drama. And I think that, there is a kind of a, I don't know what it takes to snap out of that, except that I think, for most of us, it certainly has to do with our children, for one thing, the kind of example we want to set to our children. I think, the idea that I would never be able to turn to my daughter and say, I'm going to Washington to go smear feces on the wall of the Capitol, and I hope you grow up to be just like Dad. I think that's part of it. I also think we spend too much time alone, and I think part of the way we get past this is to stop looking inward. To step. I say this even though I have a big social media presence and I spend a lot of time, like we're doing right now, looking into cameras. But, to just spend time with your family, to spend time with other people, to spend time with your dog, your cat, and to think about the fact that there are things in the world bigger than you that are worth being grateful for. The emotion that no longer defines America, that once did define America, was gratitude. My grandparents came here from villages in Greece and Ireland. No matter what they said about the United States, they were grateful, and they imbued their children with gratitude. And my parents, to be called ungrateful by your parents was like that. That was one of those, they could call you a brat, they could call you a punk, whatever. To say you're ungrateful, it's like, was like the worst thing that your parents could say to you. How could you do this to us? How could you throw things away? And I think we just don't think that way anymore. We imagine, and I know we have to wrap up, so let me throw out a quote from a president that I actually think is overrated, John F. Kennedy. But think about this for a moment. When Kennedy says, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Imagine a president having the audacity to say that now. People would go ape. Whatever you think of John F. Kennedy, that was one of the greatest inaugural speeches ever. And, the idea of saying, stop asking what your country can do for you. Stop demanding things and ask instead how you can help the country. And I think people need to kind of shake themselves out of this for a moment and say, am I a good citizen? Am I doing the right thing here? And we just don't do that. We say, this is about me, and I'm angry, and I'm living in the moment. And whatever I think and feel right now is reality. And that we're doomed. If people don't get out of that mindset, one way or another, we're doomed. It's over.
I love this book because it's optimistic in a way, because it is up to us. If we're the enemy and we're doing this to ourselves, we can stop doing that.
Yes, we have control over this situation. We have, when people say, well, I'm powerless. You're not powerless. If you really believe that you're powerless, then what's the point of anything anymore? The fact that, the fact that you can literally walk the streets yelling, I feel powerless. Hey, I'll tell you what, I spent a lot of time in the old Soviet Union. Nobody walked down the streets of Leningrad saying, I feel powerless. I think the government's too strong. Nobody listens to me. That does not happen in genuinely repressive states.
No, definitely.
And so I think people need to take a deep breath and think about the things, the things that are good in their life, even if you're broke, even if you're sick, even if you're, let me just end this on a very emotional plea. I have been broke. I have been sick. I have been divorced and, living on peanuts and, thinking about dropping out of school and not knowing how I'm going to make my rent. It can happen to anyone. But the idea that somehow, therefore, the United States of America is a giant failed experiment because things aren't going my way is lunacy.
It is lunacy.
And it is childish lunacy. And we have to stop doing it.
That's a perfect place to end the conversation. Tom, thank you so much for your book, your work. What's next on your research writing agenda?
I actually want to think more about Hoffer's warning about mass psychosis. I think I'm really surprised. You're writing about conspiracy theories. I'm really surprised the number of people who are emerging into public life and at town meetings and, other that seem genuinely. And I actually spoke about this with a psychologist. Almost psychotic, like literally not capable of comprehending reality. And Hoffer warns about this. He talks about how people will start just creating out of this kind of boredom and ennui and resentment. They start creating their own reality. But that might be a project for further down the line. I still have another few months of my federal service. I teach for a federal institution, and I'm going to retire in the winter, and then I'll be a full-time moral scold and curmudgeon.
Well, we need that. That's what we do when we get older. We become our parents. All right, Tom.
I figure, Andy Rooney's been gone a while. Somebody's got to do it. So,
have you ever noticed?
Thank you, Michael.